This is Hampton, Virginia, USA, formerly known as Point Comfort. Today, it's just a normal town, but this was the first location where 20 enslaved Africans arrived America in late August of 1619. They arrived aboard an English ship, the White Lion. Shortly after their arrival, they were traded in exchange for supplies. They were sold as slaves. These slaves were taken from here, in West Central Africa, around the Congo, and some from Angola. They were only the first of many. At the time, West Central Africa was a hotspot for slave trade, mainly controlled by Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and other European countries. Most of these slaves were taken to the New World, known today as America. By 1840, the slave trade came to an end, but then a few years later, European powers began new conquest, the scramble for Africa. From 1884, Great Britain, France, Spain, Germany, Belgium, and Italy all rushed to claim land in Africa, sharing territories in Africa amongst themselves like a loaf of bread. European control in Africa continued until the 1960s, when independence was achieved by most of these African countries, but that was only after serious struggles and resistance. Then came the Neocolonialism era. This was an era where from 1961, the All-African Peoples Conference described neocolonialism as the deliberate and continued survival of the colonial system in independent African states, and this seemed far worse than the colonial era, probably because it turned previously colonized African states into victims of political, mental, economic, social, military, and technical forms of domination, affecting the growth of the African continent. France, for example, through the France-Afrique, continued their influence in Africa by keeping close ties and controls with their previously controlled African countries. And this was very important for President Charles de Gaulle of France to maintain their global power. The United States, on its part, supported France being in Africa for their own benefits, of course, and to help avoid the Soviet Union from controlling any African region, and that was during the Cold War. French and US control has remained visible in the African continent right up until today, as it can be seen with numerous military bases owned by these countries around Africa.
And in the past, any president that has tried to back the system and do something about taking control of the financial resources, and I'm talking about African countries depositing their bank reserves with France, I'm talking about African countries giving up their natural resources, no value addition, France having first right of refusal for all the natural resources discovered yet to be discovered, France companies having first right of refusal for all contracts, large, small, private, public, France having military presence in those countries, and France having the ability to invade them in the event that they feel their interests are being violated. France making sure that those countries can only be trained by France, the military can only be trained by France, the military equipment can only be bought from France. Come on now, our people didn't understand all this.
Lately, everything is changing really fast, and the worst nightmare of the West for Africa is slowly becoming a reality, especially with the rise of China and Russia. This is 36-year-old Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the current interim leader of West Africa's Burkina Faso, who took power since a coup d'etat in September 2022. Since his rise to power, his government has expelled French troops, recalled the French ambassador, expelled 3 French diplomats, and suspended some French media outlets. And as leader of Burkina Faso, which is a former French colony, Traoré says he is against French policies. At the same time, he has signed multi-cooperation deals with China and Russia, which is in turn shunning the West. Nevertheless, Burkina Faso is just one of many African countries that is cutting ties with the West and siding with China and Russia. From South Africa cheerleading the BRICS with China and Russia, to Niger kicking out US troops from their country, it has now become evidently clear that Africa has chosen a side. Despite many news outlets insisting that China's interest in Africa is colonialism, followed by debt traps to control Africa's resources, most African leaders see the relationships between their countries and China as a complete, reasonable mutual agreement, unlike most previous relationships with the West, including France and the United States. Now, I know many will ask this question, but why the sudden change of heart? After decades of Western control in Africa, why are Africans suddenly having cold feet in transacting with the West? Why are they choosing China? Well, the real truth behind Africa's China choice goes back to the sad experiences which the continent has had with the West, right up until today, which seems to have yielded little to no fruits for the continent of Africa, despite being home to over 30% of the world's natural resources. Africa, as we all know, is a continent renowned for its rich resources like gold, diamond, platinum, oil, and so much more. But despite this richness, Africa has historically been subjected to multiple external influences, particularly from Western powers. From the slave trade era through the colonial era right on to present day, Africa's relationship with the West has been marked by exploitation, dependency, and uneven power control. Reason why I believe Africa is where it is today.
Over the years, it would appear that the West has taken things in Africa for granted. It has been seen as if Africa had no power, both at international institutions and within the political scenario where the West appeared to influence the outcome of elections in quite a number of countries. But what the Chinese have done, they've come in without any conditions at all, just saying that they wanted to do business and stay away from politics.
There is a serious problem for the West, for sure. I think the West did not see it coming. However, it was very naive of the Western nations to think that the exploitation of Africa was going to continue unabated forever.
While Western powers have traditionally played a dominant role in Africa's economic and political landscape, the continent's political and economic progress has been hugely influenced, probably not for the best of the African citizens. Reason why I believe more African nations are turning to China as a preferred partner, drawn by China's offers of investment, infrastructural development, and trade relations without the political conditions often attached to Western aid. And most of China's projects can clearly be seen across the continent, with many Chinese engineers and laborers even traveling to the continent to work alongside African engineers. I know many will be wondering and asking this question, but where did China come from all of a sudden? And how did they get a foothold in the African continent? But we need to understand that the Africa-China relationship didn't just start today. Well, to give you a brief history, the foundation of the Sino-African relations began in the late 1950s when China signed bilateral trade agreements with Algeria, Egypt, Guinea, South Africa, and Sudan as then Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai made a 10-country tour of Africa between December 1963 and January 1964. But the real turning point in Africa's relationship with China can be traced far back to the early 21st century, when China began to significantly ramp up its engagement with the continent. Initiatives such as the Forum on China-African Cooperation and the Belt and Road Initiative signaled China's growing interest in Africa's economic potential, and of course its desire to foster mutually beneficial partnerships as China's economy began to break boundaries and make a name globally. China, of course, as the world's manufacturer, is always in need of raw materials, and most of these can be found in Africa. So as trade goes, China has approached Africans with more favorable exchange and trade deals, in sharp contrast to Western deals, which have often approached Africa, leaving Africa as less of a beneficiary. China seemed to have presented itself as a mere attractive alternative, offering African nations opportunities for growth, infrastructural development, and technological advancement, all this without the historical baggage of colonialism, and not even the imposition of political conditions, which is one of the main problems that most Africans have always had with the West. Projects such as the construction of the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway in Ethiopia, financed by Chinese loans and built by Chinese companies, exemplify China's commitment to investing in Africa's transportation structure. China has even invested in many other sectors in Africa which are clearly visible, like the telecommunications, energy, and manufacturing, which have fueled Africa's economic expansion and, of course, provided much needed employment opportunities for millions of Africans.
The United States is all in on Africa's future.
I'm very excited about the impact of the future of Africa on the rest of the world, including the United States of America.
We're not only interested in extracting resources. We want to partner with you to create local value chains, to create good jobs here in Africa.
Although Western powers still continue to play a significant role in Africa's affairs, the rise of China as a major player in the continent's economic and geopolitical landscape offers African nations a viable alternative and a path towards greater autonomy, which of course gives them a higher bargaining power. Africa's preference for engaging with China while showing caution towards traditional Western powers has become increasingly evident. Now, when we talk about China's role in Africa, it can clearly be seen in many sectors with realistic examples. China, for example, is Africa's largest two-way trading partner, exceeding by a factor of 4 US-Africa trade. And China has been Africa's largest trading partner since 2009, when it surpassed the United States, and continues to be by far its largest trading partner as of 2022. Chinese-funded projects have definitely transformed the physical landscape of many African countries, fostering connectivity and economic growth. And as expected, Africa's embrace of China is not without reservations. And as I mentioned earlier, many concerns have been raised, mainly by Western media, about the transparency of Chinese loans and, of course, debt sustainability in the African continent. But many people seem to wonder if the West is just worried that they are losing a grip on the African continent.
Refuting and debunking this notion that is propagated by people who are envious and jealous of this relationship, that it's a new colonialism. There's no new colonialism. This is a relationship that has its roots deep in history.
And yes, the West has always given aid to African countries, but the truth is that multiple impositions of conditions attached to Western aid and investment often undermines Africa's sovereignty and hinders its development aspirations. Worst of all, Western interventions in African affairs, such as military interventions and regime changes, have fueled resentment and mistrust, with recent actions that can clearly be seen from the coup in Niger through Burkina Faso, alongside other African nations that have been taken over by the military. And on broader terms, Africa's strategic shift towards China and away from the West is definitely pushing the West to make more positive moves towards Africa, unlike before. Talk about a win for Africa. China's rise as a global power challenges the dominance of traditional Western powers, offering African nations an alternative avenue for development and partnership. And of course, African countries often prefer China's approach to security norms and principles such as non-interventionism and respect for state sovereignty, which effectively limits Western influence in many African countries. At the end of the day, Africa's strategic choices in its engagement with China and of course with the West are influenced by a desire to be fully independent and of course not rely on Western control as much as before, while pursuing economic development and growth. The reality is that Africa is currently at a pivotal moment in its history and of course struggling to shape its own destiny amidst a changing global landscape, and by leveraging partnerships with China strategically, Africa has the potential to correct the mistakes of the past. As it has been said time and again, Africa's young population definitely gives Africa an advantage for the future. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell for more videos like this weekly. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, this is Willen. See you next time.